And yes, I noticed that it was the Palm Sunday, which is traditionally the time that we look at the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem and the palms being waved. And if you know me a little bit, you know I don't do many traditional things, but I thought I'll do something untraditional for myself and speak about the traditional theme for this Sunday, and look at the meaning and the significance of that story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And like many of the stories that we have, there are a lot of stories behind it that leads up to that story. And I want to look at the the story that leads up to the story that we read of in, it's in John 12, from verse 12 to 15, Jesus entering Jerusalem and people being very excited about that entry, and he enters on a donkey. And where does that story have its origin? How did it develop into that expectation? And ultimately, what does it have to do with your story? Okay. What is that story of somebody sitting on a donkey thousands of years ago got anything to do with you sitting here in Sausalito? Hey, it's got a lot to do with you. Its message is profound and powerful. So, let me think, where will I start? The expectation for a Messiah wasn't the expectation that was just, that suddenly, miraculously fell out of heaven. And people who one day just went about their lives suddenly found themselves hoping for Messiah. No, that expectation for Messiah was very intimately linked with their journey. The history of Israel, what they experienced, what they suffered, worked within them an expectation for a very specific kind of Messiah. And the expectation was transformed and changed throughout their history. And we're going to see why that is so. But for a moment, I think if we want to really have a little bit of a glimpse into where the story starts, we've got to transport ourselves to a time where stories for the first time were being written. Can you imagine that? There's no libraries, there's no market for literature. There's no authors like we know authors today who sit down and think, I've got the idea I want to communicate. Books aren't bought and sold. The entire world's literature is a few scripts. And if you want to become literate, you go and become part of that scribal class, which was a very elite, small little group that normally worked for the established kingdom, empire, or the religious elite, and they are mostly intertwined. So your government, your ruling party, and your priests are very much the same class. Now, what happens in that situation is what they write has got a very specific point of view. Letters are written by the elite. These letters are written by the victorious empire. And the stories that emerges out of the Middle East is stories that supports our king, our kingdom, and the system by which we rule. And therefore, most of the myths that emerges during that time are myths that sees chaos as the greatest threat, violent chaos as the greatest threat to our society, and through an act of creative violence or sacred violence or sacrifice, the profane violence is overcome by a new kind of violence, which instead of just destroying the whole community, sacred violence unites the community. And so we find that many of the ancient societies that we discover, one of the most significant signs of a civilization is a grave or a tomb or a body, where somehow a community has found a way, instead of destroying themselves, they found a way of diverting their conflict from one another onto a single scapegoat. And they transformed the war of all against the war of all against one. And that's where the practice of sacrifice begins. And that is the first sign of a civilization. And the Bible itself also tells us that the first civilization, the city of the Canaanites, was founded by a murderer when sacrifice went wrong. So it sees that the very foundation of our society is murderous. What does this have to do with the expectation for a Messiah? Well, I want to kind of set the scene to help you understand what is the mindset, what are the stories that's being written. Because when a community in chaos converts to murder a scapegoat, the people that write the stories are the survivors. And the survivors always says, we were innocent and the scapegoat was guilty. And somehow a faceless justice demanded its death. Because we cannot bear to see the real cause of his death, and that is, we murdered him. All kinds of myths develop that tells us of an angry God who demands blood. And we are just the innocent bystanders that does what God demands. Now, in the midst of those mythology and those stories being written, whether it's Enum Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh, many myths that arises from the Middle East, a very radical new story is emerging. And it is radical because the people who begin to write this story aren't the elite. They are slaves who are delivered from the violence of the empire, and their story begins when they are as down as you can get them. They are hardly above animals. In fact, animals are treated better in many of these empires than their slaves. And so when these people start writing a story from their perspective, it's obviously going to be radically different from the expected stories, from the traditional, the accepted stories. Their stories is going to have a different point of view. They see a God who doesn't just come to endorse the status quo, but a God who continually disrupts the established order. A God that says, as long as there are victims, the system that produces these victims will be under threat from the God who identifies with victims. And so a new expectation is starting to grow within Israel. They expect a deliverer, somebody that actually cares for the poor, for the weak, for those who are suffering injustice. A God who is not simply there to endorse our thinking and our way of doing things. Because if God is always on your side, if God hates all the people you hate, then you can be absolutely certain that that God has been made by you in your image and your likeness. But if God is truly just, if God is truly the God who thinks about the well-being of all creation, then it's going to extend beyond just your comfort in terms of what it means for others. And so this story develops, the scriptures is unique, first of all, because it's written from the point of view of victims as opposed to from the elite ruling class. Now, obviously, it's not black and white, because what we'll see is that slaves becomes kings and things starts changing. The story changes as well. Before I get there, I want to quickly focus in on this one aspect as well. The fact that they are living in a world that has got a polytheistic worldview. They believe there are many gods. All over, they manifest themselves in different natural forces, and these gods are always vying for position. And the way in which we determine whether our God is stronger than your God is our tribe engage in warfare with your God, and may the strongest God win. And so what often happened is when one tribe is obliterated or overcome by another tribe, they would just denounce their God, those who are left, and they would accept the God of the victorious tribe, because obviously it looks like it's a better idea to serve him. So as Israel emerges from polytheism into monotheism, and that as well isn't just a sudden revelation where God comes and says, you've got it all wrong. There's only one God, and they just change their minds. No, it's a progressive story. In fact, what I do in the book Desire Found Me, I'm sorry, I think I only have one copy here. You can find them on Amazon. But one of the things I do is to show in the Old Testament that there were actual writers of the scriptures who were polytheistic in their worldview, who had the typical idea that there's one high God with a pantheon of many other gods. And what I show in Deuteronomy 32 is that exact portion where El, the Most High God, divides up the nations according to how many sons he has, according to the sons of El, and to Yahweh, which is one of the sons of El, he gives Judah. Now that might be a bit shocking, but the fact is Israel begins as a nation just like all the other nations that believes Yahweh is our God, our tribe's God, and the other tribes have got other gods, and we're going to overcome them because our God is stronger. And as they start to progress as a nation and start to become stronger and more established, it's only natural that Yahweh has a promotion within their theology as well. And so Yahweh becomes the Most High God. But it's a progression. It's a story that's being told throughout the Old Testament. What does that have to do with the expectation for a Messiah? Well, it has a powerful influence in this. When Israel is defeated by other nations, because they have now transformed their theology into being monotheistic, they can no longer see this defeat as a defeat of Yahweh, but rather as the discipline of Yahweh. If there's only one God who's in control of everything, he surely can discipline us and deliver us from that discipline. And so this is fundamental for Israel to survive within exile, because there's many times where they are almost obliterated. Why is it that their tradition, their belief system, etc., continues where all the other tribes just give up their gods and say this God is stronger? It's because of this monotheistic belief that is emerging. Now, the next one. I'm going to do 5. So those are 3 influences. The unique perspective of their scriptures, that it comes from the point of view of those in slavery, is number 1. The second one was the move from polytheism to monotheism. The third one is the emergence of the monarchy. The monarchy, the kingdom with a king that rules over this whole nation. Now, the first time when that was suggested to Israel, it was not a popular idea. In fact, many of the people said, this is wrong. Because what happened until that stage is people would live in their tribes, live in their communities, and when a crisis arose, God would inspire a charismatic leader, and he or she would rise up to the challenge and do whatever was necessary. It was a kind of direct theistic rule. When there's crisis, God intervenes through whomever he chooses. But when you move away from that into the monarchy, and Samuel tells the people, first of all, he says to God, God, they're rejecting me. And God says, no, they're rejecting me. So you can see this wasn't the easy transition into the monarchy. Why is this a problem? Because our very identity is based on the fact that we serve a God that delivers people from empires, from systems of oppression. And now if you want a king is going to want labor, taxes. And if the kingdom grows and there becomes, wealth comes, wealth needs to be protected. And this protection is going to require armies and soldiers and weapons. And so we were delivered from that. And now you say, we want that? And so the first king is almost given as a punishment. And Saul just causes havoc. David starts... the second king is the one anointed, and he starts actually building borders and bringing security. But the kingdom finds its kind of crescendo in Solomon. And what's ironic, if we read in 1 Kings 5, is how Solomon, in honor of Yahweh, he builds a temple, and he has forced laborers, 30,000 people who does this, 70,000 doing that, and 80,000 woodcutters, forced laborers. In other words, slavery. So in the honor of the God who delivers slaves from the empire, he builds a temple using slave labor. In 1 Kings 4, we also read that where does Israel's wealth come from? Well, Solomon had 12,000 chariots. He had horses and chariots. This is the best that a nation of war could have, is all these weaponry, and most of their wealth comes by trading arms with Egypt. In other words, Israel became what they were delivered from. And so, in this place of prosperity, in this place where our wealth needs protection, it's easy for our memories to get dim. It's easy to forget this God who's on the side of victims. What victims? Look at our prosperous community. It's so easy to forget on whose side this God is. But very soon Israel finds themselves overcome by the Assyrians and later by the Babylonians, and so they are being torn apart. They find themselves back into slavery, and their very expectation of what a deliverer, what a Messiah should be, is being transformed during this time. In Psalm 72, we see their expectation that the king would be the anointed one. May the Lord make the king his son. And so the king becomes the Son of God. He becomes the one that's going to deliver this nation. And so this expectation that we will have a king that is different from other kings, that will produce a kingdom that is different from other kingdoms. The Old Testament is the record of their utter failure to live up to the expectation of a king and a kingdom that is different. Because over and over the kings prove we are just as corrupt. We produce a kingdom that requires the same kind of violence to stabilize it and to keep it in rule as all the other kingdoms. And so as their expectation is shattered in the exile, it is also being transformed, and it actually acquires a much greater depth, because they're starting to understand that the way in which we did kingdom was not the kingdom of God. The way in which we did our society was not the society God imagined. And if indeed God wants to establish his kingdom on this earth, he will have to have an agenda much greater than just the prosperity of my nation. He's got to have an agenda much greater than just securing the boundaries of Israel. Because if this kingdom is indeed going to be just, it's going to be a kingdom of peace. So in the midst of this, I want to read you a little bit. So regarding the monarchy, let me grab some water as well. Please stay with me. I'm getting to where this and what this means for you. It's a bit of history. You know, sometimes we so just accept the cliches and our beliefs, and we've got no idea where they come from. And actually starting to understand how these beliefs, how these expectations grew, developed, will give you much greater insight into why do we believe this? And maybe also some of the things we believe, it's not worth believing and might need to be replaced. Oh, that's exciting. So from the very inception of Israel's monarchy, their history demands a very different expectation of both the king and the kingdom. They expect more than a system of oppression, more than war and violence, because they are people who worship a God who's concerned for the oppressed. They expect a king and a kingdom in which righteousness and justice will reign. And so although they moved away from direct theocratic rule, they still expect God to rule them through the mediation of the monarchy. And then, this is so important. As they go into, during the Syrian war, King Ahaz, who's one of David's descendants from the house of David, while he's busy losing a battle, he's given this sign: "Behold, a young woman will conceive and bear a son, and he will be named Emmanuel. For behold, this child will know how to refuse evil and choose good." So they're starting to realize that all our kings, no matter how we honored them, no matter how we hoped that God would find a way to rule through them, they still did not know how to resist evil and choose good. But this hope is being renewed, that somebody will be born that will know how to do exactly this. And the promise of a deliverer who could live up to the expectations of being a representative of God grew even stronger as the weakness and failures of their own kings became obvious. This messianic king would usher in a kingdom unlike all the other kingdoms. And in Isaiah 11 verse 4 it says, "And with righteousness he will judge the poor, and with equity the meek of the earth." So not only is the hope intensified during this period of suffering, but it's also expanded. God's concern is for more than Israel. His concern is for the oppressed, for the poor, for the meek. If this is indeed God's kingdom, it's going to be much larger than our nationalistic, patriotic hopes. So it will be nothing less. Oh, it's so beautiful here. You see, the goal of this kingdom is a kingdom that will cover the whole earth as the waters cover the sea. And it will be nothing less than a whole new creation in which violence will be vanquished. Now, is that just a pipe dream in the midst of a world with so much violence? Jesus comes to introduce an idea that has nothing less in mind than the total obliteration of violence in our world. And obviously we're not quite there. But I want to show you how this idea has already began to transform the world we live in. So many people obviously still people don't make up their minds and move in another direction all at once at the same time. So there are many people in Israel that still had the expectation of the victorious warrior-like king, the king that will come to enforce his will and his ideas upon this planet. And for that reason, Jesus turned out to be quite a disappointment to many of the people who so looked forward to his coming, because don't we want a God that just comes and sets things right, sort it out, enforce justice? And isn't that the expectation that many people still have of his second coming? You know, the first coming, very interesting, nice, and whatever, we can philosophize. But really what we want is for God to come back and do what he failed to do the first time. And that is to set up a kingdom in which there is no dispute, in which he rules with an iron fist. And what the disappointment Jesus is when he comes to reveal a God strong enough to become weak. A God who doesn't come to take a hold of your life and manipulate you into his will, but the God who comes and places himself in your hands and says, what do you want to do with me? You can even kill me if you want to. But I'm not the God that's here to manipulate you or to control you. I'm the God of infinite possibilities who says, whatever you desire, I will back it. Whatever you want to do, I will support it, but I'm not here to control you or manipulate you. I'm the God that comes to find my own freedom of expression in your freedom. That's why I'm totally committed to your freedom. And so Zechariah has a vision entirely of a different kind than this, of a different kind of coming king. This king will be humble. He will put an end to the chariots of war, and he will bring peace to all nations. And so where we get Palm Sunday from is from Zechariah 9 verse 9 till 12, and it reads as follows: Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and salvation is he, humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule shall be from sea to sea, from the ends of the rivers to the ends of the earth. Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. And so a vision arises of a king and a kingdom that will not resort to violence to establish its rule. A king that comes to introduce us to a different way of being human. You don't have to be human by suppressing, oppressing, and obliterating all that stands in your way. And so this is the exact song and poem that's being sung as Jesus enters into Jerusalem, in complete contrast to the Roman Empire, who would enter on their war horses carrying their trophies of battle. So let me finish this before I get to the things I want to say. I want to rush off too quickly. So we've said that the Exodus, because these scriptures are written by the slaves, by the victims, it has a uniquely different point of view. The move from polytheism to monotheism means that Israel's God survives exiles and defeats, etc. This hope continues. The monarchy, their very failure to live up to this God who delivers the weak and the oppressed gives hope to a much deeper expectation of a king that will actually have more than our national security in mind. A king who thinks about the peace of the nations, of the world. So the expectations is transformed during the exile, but it's also expanded. And so Daniel writes in Daniel 7, and he has this vision of one like the Son of Man who stands almost at the end of history looking back. And Israel is not even mentioned because in the context of human history, it's a very small part. But as he looks back, he doesn't just see the King of Israel, but he sees one like the Son of Man. And so Israel's hope for a national deliverer is being expanded into a hope of a son of man, the one who comes to restore humanity to the sonship that God has always envisaged for us. The one who restores the image and likeness that God intended for all of humanity to bear. So the hope is being transformed and expanded. And so instead of every empire through creative violence bringing unity to their community, Jesus needs to overturn that very process that says through violence we can put an end to every argument. And a few days later it looks like that is exactly what happens. Isn't it? This little troublemaker, we've won the argument in the most convincing way possible. He's dead and we're still here. So the argument's over. You can forget his nice little sentimental stories of love and all these fluffy things of how we can do community in a new way and forgive. We've shown you the real stuff, how this world works. And that is those with the force and the might are able to shut up those who cannot compete with that kind of force. I don't want to spoil Easter Sunday, but I want to go into a little bit into complete. There's so much to be said about it in any case. You can have 1,000 other messages on Easter. I just want to focus in on the beauty of the resurrection then. Because, whereas every other community was built upon a founding murder. Even the myths of Rome was Romulus murdering his brother, and in that way, Rome was established. Every society has its birth that through a creative act of selective violence we have established our community. Now, the scriptures from the very beginning starts to undo that myth. Even the story of the flood, which is a radical subversion of many of the other flood stories that were already in circulation in that time. But what the Genesis story does in radically subverting their mythical ideas is this: that instead of God being on the side of the whole community and against the minority, what this story is suggesting is maybe God is on the side of the minority. And maybe it's the whole community that's guilty. Now, it by no means debunks that whole myth, but it starts to suggest ideas that's going to radically transform our thinking within our communities. And so whereas every new community in the myths and in actual anthropology and history was established on a creative murder, a corpse, Jesus comes to establish a new community founded on an empty tomb, founded on the absence of a victim, founded on an event that continually expands to include victims, to include those who felt they were excluded, to embrace those who were victimized. And for this very reason, to Israel, he said, "You will not make an image for me. You will not carve, you will not choose what image you place upon me, because I will choose my own image." And the image that God ultimately chooses in the person of Jesus is the image of the suffering victim. Why does he choose that image for himself? Because that image cannot be manipulated. That image cannot be used to push forward my agenda. That image continually reminds us, on whose side is this God? And so in Jesus, God comes to reveal that he would rather suffer our violence than participate in it. That he would rather go to hell with us than abandon us there. A God that is more involved in every detail of your life and your existence than what you've ever imagined. And this Messiah introduces an idea to humanity that there's a different way of being human. There's a way in which you, instead of getting even, you can forgive. Instead of becoming destructive, you can heal. And unfortunately, we've misinterpreted the cross so often and interpreted the violence of the cross as somehow redemptive, that it is the violence that God required to redeem us. No, that violence was never God's. I mean, Jesus, there's nothing about his life and teaching that is destructive, dehumanizing, or vicious or violent. And so the cross stands in complete contrast to who he was in person. Everybody that met him became more alive. The blind sees, the deaf hears. He intensifies our senses. The lame walk. I've come to give you life in abundance. Everyone who contacts him becomes more alive. There's nothing about this Jesus that dehumanizes or destroys life, but he celebrates human life. So Jesus had no sick psychological obsession with violence. But maybe it's just because, he was human. Maybe it's the Father that required this violence in order to settle the score. It certainly looks like that on the night before the crucifixion when he prays, Father, I don't want to drink this cup, but not my will, but your will be done. Maybe the violence of what is to come is something that the Father, it's a technicality that he can overlook for the sake of the greater good. But when we start looking at who the parties involved were on the cross, between the Father, the Son, and man, we see that when Jesus spoke about his own death, he never referred to it as a payment or a transaction. In fact, Jesus doesn't even speak of the mission of his life, as we often hear in our Christian circles, as I've come to die, or I've come to give my life. Whenever Jesus speaks about his mission, he ends off with the resurrection. He says, I will be handed over, I will die, and I will rise again. In other words, in Jesus' own understanding, the only reason that death is necessary is because he is destined for resurrection life that overcomes death. So it is the resurrection that necessitates the death. And so when he speaks in John 15 about his death as well, again, it's not payment, it's not vengeance, it's no greater love has any man than to give his life to his brothers. In Hebrews, it speaks about his death as an act of faithfulness, an act of trust, an act of belief. There's a few scriptures that I can mention, but Romans 8:32, Acts 2:23, 4:25, it makes it clear that the Father hands over the Son. The Son volunteers himself, gives himself over into the hands of his murderers. The Father hands him over precisely because he has nothing to do with the violence that is to follow. That's where he hands over the Son for man to do what man alone can do, and to subvert our ideas that God is the one who justifies violence. Because never has violence found greater justification and greater excess than when we use God to justify it. But here, Jesus reveals that the place in which God is most absent is in our violence. And so when Acts starts speaking about the death and the resurrection of Christ, when all the apostles speak of that event, they make it clear who's responsible for what. This Jesus whom you have murdered, God raised him up. This Jesus whom you crucified, God made him alive. Man does the killing, God does the raising up. God does the making alive. God's the one who comes to, in spite of our greatest evil, reverse it and say, I forgive. Because there's a different way of being human. There's a way in which you don't have to live out of a sense of insufficiency and fear. Because this is where things went wrong. Remember, I'm closing with this. In the Genesis story, when man enters into a place where we sense we lack something, God doesn't want you to be like him. That's why he withholds this tree from you. What does that suggest? You are not like God. You lack being. It's a very different suggestion than what is evident in Genesis 1, where God gives his own image and likeness to man freely, and he withholds nothing. But here in Genesis 3, this conception enters in that we lack something. And what is the result of a sense of lack? We start grasping after every fruit that promises to give us being. And what is the theological child of this Adam and Eve in their sense of inadequacy? Is the first murderer. And so Jesus comes to reveal what was hidden since the foundations of the world. That the very foundations of violent societies has been built on murder. But if that sin is what birthed our societies, then it remains under threat from the God who brings what is to nothing and who subverts the nothing into being something. The God who changes things. He's not the God who doesn't want to rock the boat. He's the God that rocks it. He's the God that just is interested in changing everything because he is the God of infinite possibilities. And so, my goodness, I'm trying to follow that story through to the resurrection. Where was I just now? Any case, I'm ending off with this. So the story begins with a mankind in such a sense of insufficiency that they grasp after every fruit to try and make them more like God. And the story ends with a God so satisfied in what he made in you that he empties himself into human form, Philippians 3, and he does not consider equality with God something that needs to be grasped after, but he is just fully satisfied with being human. Oh, the irony that we want to become more like God. And God reveals himself as the one that's fully satisfied with simply being human. Colossians 2, verse 9 and 10, the fullness of the Godhead finds their most accurate expression in this human body of Jesus Christ. He's satisfied with your humanity. And so what is redemptive about that act of violence is not because God delights in violence, but what is redemptive is that Jesus, in this place of being fully satisfied with simply being human, refusing to bow his knee to systems of oppression, because of his love for his friends and his trust in his Father, overcomes our most fundamental fear, our fear of death, through this trust and through this love. And he comes and shows us, as the pioneer of our faith, that there's a way in which we do not have to live in inadequacy, in fear, not even at the greatest threat, but by simply being satisfied with being human, living in love for our friends and trust in our Father. We need not fear anything. Anything. So, wow, I love this gospel story. I love this Palm Sunday in which everything's just heating up for the crescendo to come. For God to subvert our ideas of who He is and who we are. Our ideas of a God that's distant, that's somewhere else, is inverted by the God who is called Emmanuel, God with us. In other words, the true God is not God without us. The true God revealed in Jesus is God with us. A God so committed to your existence that the incarnation is His declaration. I don't want to be God by myself, with myself, or for myself. The only way in which I want to be God is with man, for man, and as man. And this is God's method of salvation. He saves whatever He becomes. And He becomes us in our deepest darkness, alienation, and confusion. And this is part of why the cross was necessary. For God to demonstrate to us that even in your greatest hell, I am experiencing everything you experience with you. There's not a moment, not an experience you've ever had that I have not had with you. And this God can confidently speak to you because He understands you better than what you understand yourself. And His message is that hell, that death, is not the end of your story. There's a resurrection that follows. There's a new opportunity. There's new possibilities that follows the depth of that suffering and that pain. Awesome. So thank you very much. We enjoyed being with you again today, and it's always such a special time here in Sausalito. We love it. Thank you. Mary Ann, don't you want to do another song? I think Mary Ann's got a song or two that beautifully summarizes this whole message.